Hello everyone, let's continue our discussion on the different kinds or different modes of extinguishing obligation. So we are on our second one. From here onwards, I will be discussing only the very important provisions under this topic. So to start with, let's have loss of the thing due as a mode of extinguishing obligation. So before we're gonna go on to that, we will have a brief recall of what is the concept of loss, or when could we consider that a thing is lost? So there is loss when the thing perishes or it goes out of commerce, or when it disappears that in such a way that its existence could no longer be known or it could not be recovered. So as a consequence to that, there would be the impossibility of performance. So the impossibility of a performance because of the loss of the thing due, it must be subsequent to the execution of the contract in order to extinguish the obligation, not that the impossibility existed at the time the contract is executed, because if that would be the scenario, the result would not be extinguishment, but instead it is inefficacy of the obligation. So we've known that one. Another important concept is that the difference between a determinate and a indeterminate thing. So when we say determinate, it is particularly designated or physically segregated from all others of the same class, right? So as what I have given you as an example way back, that's when the object or the subject of the obligation is a car. When we say it is particularly designated or physically segregated, well, basically there is the designation of the engine number, the chassis number, the plate number, all other serial numbers that would really identify the object, which would render it irreplaceable or not substitutable by any other kind. And then for a generic or a determinate thing, well, it is not really particularly designated. So that would be relevant in this topic. And to start, we'll have Article 1262. And under 1262, it says that an obligation which consists in the delivery of a determinate thing shall be extinguished if it should be lost or destroyed without the fault of the debtor and before he has incurred for delay. So here it clearly tells us that when could the loss of a determinate thing extinguish obligation? Well, the loss or destruction, it should be without the fault of the debtor and before the obligor debtor has incurred for delay. And to state otherwise with this scenario is that the loss of a determinate thing shall not extinguish obligation if the loss or destruction is with fault on the part of the debtor and he has incurred delay. So that would be the scenario as an exception to the rule that a loss of a specific or determinate thing would basically extinguish the obligation. Other than that, even though if it is a determinate thing, there would still be a liability if by contract stipulations or by provisions of law and the nature of the obligation requires the assumption of risks. Well, in those cases, still the obligor is liable for under the obligation, despite also the happening of a fortuitous events. In cases man, there would be fortuitous events. Second paragraph in the law or stipulation, the obligor is liable even for fortuitous events. The loss of the thing does not extinguish the obligation, and he shall be responsible for damages. The same rule applies when the nature of the obligation requires the assumption of risks. So partly I've mentioned this one already, that a specific or determinate thing, the loss of a specific or determinate thing, the obligation is extinguished except when by provision of law or by contract stipulation. And then when the nature of the obligation requires for the assumption of risks. So still, the obligor would be liable. What happens when the object of the obligation is to deliver a generic thing or an indeterminate thing? Well, the loss or destruction under 1263 of anything of the same kind does not extinguish the obligation. What's the reason behind this one? Because here, if you could recall, when it comes to a generic or indeterminate thing, it could really be replaced, right? So the obligation as a consequence is not extinguished under the principle that the genus never perishes. Genus nunquam perit, diba? If you could recall that one. Except when it is the limited generic thing. But the very general rule is that if generic or indeterminate thing is the subject of the obligation, well, the obligation is not extinguished. Question now, what would happen if there will be a fortuitous event? So like, let's say for example, with us we have floods, we have typhoons. Well, in the event that there is a happening of a fortuitous event, it in itself, it does not necessarily extinguish an obligation, especially if it's a delivery of a determinate thing. So this has been mentioned in the second paragraph of 1262. The delivery of a determinate thing shall only be extinguished when the object is lost or destroyed without the fault of the debtor and before he is in default or has incurred for delay. Hope this one is very clear to you on the second mode of extinguishing obligations.